Good afternoon, folks. So, as introduced, like I'm Akhil Mohan. I'm a software engineer. I'm mostly working on open source projects, and I'm a maintainer of Containerd, which most of you might have heard of if you're working in Kubernetes or DevOps. So, I'll be talking about Finch. It is like an open source client for container development that has been developed internally by AWS and later open source. So, our agenda for today will be like we will be discussing about container development, what are the challenges that the developers face, and like how Finch tries to help them in doing that, a little part of that. So, containers. So, we are now in, you can say like we are in a container era, like we are, our code and applications are deployed as containers. Sometimes even the development environments are like inside a container. For example, you have development environment like tools like Gitpod that helps you, that gives you development environment inside a container. And also like containers are used to check like different OS compatibility versions. So recently, like when Ubuntu 22 was released, there was an issue with like the glibc compatibility issues. So like whatever you compiled with glibc on Ubuntu 22 doesn't work on like Ubuntu 20. So all these issues could be like, you could, instead of launching a VM and testing it, you can just directly test it on a container. So when you are developing with containers or like writing for applications to be hosted in containers, like you will have the developers will have a development environment, and like what are the challenges they face. So if the developers are on Linux, like it's like 99% everything is sorted. Like all the development tools are available, so you don't need like additional stuff to do the development like Docker, Podman. Whatever you need, it's like already open source and it's like available on the OS itself. But if you are on like Windows or Mac OS, you may have to rely to proprietary tools like Docker Desktop or Rancher Desktop. Rancher is like still free. But that is like something that for personal use, that is still fine. But if you think it at an enterprise level, that is difficult. To get a Docker Desktop license for like a company having like 10,000 engineers, it's like too difficult. There is, okay, now suppose you the macOS containers. So like if you are using macOS, then like there is something called macOS containers. So most of you will be like only familiar with Linux, and like some of you may have used Windows containers. But there is something called like macOS containers also. It's like kind of in an experimental state now because of the very limited capability of the macOS kernel. So like the proper isolation is not possible. So we'll be mostly focusing on Linux containers. Okay. Yeah. So more challenges are there, and like if you have deployed containers, most of them will be like either a Linux and Windows containers that are deployed across your Kubernetes clusters, or like in microservice, like most of the containers are like Linux and Windows. But the developers will be like either using like Mac OS or Windows. But some of them will be like using Linux, but like I'm not sure like how much people are now more adopting to Linux, but still like people rely on Mac OS for development or Windows. So in such a scenario, if you want to develop on Mac and to test a container, you actually need to have a Linux VM set up on a Mac and then do the testing in that. So there is like it's like actually a bit difficult process. You have to create a Linux VM, then you have to install Docker or like some other tools that helps to launch containers, then like set up the file and networking share, because like all your code will be on like your file system on Mac. You need to get all that inside the VM. That is again difficult. Setting up the network. So if you are testing some web server applications or something, getting the network setup is like again too difficult. So that's it. So like if you want to immediately start working on something, the initial setup may cost you like 1 hour itself for the 1 day itself for the setup. Yeah. So what is Finch? Finch is a open source tool that has been developed by AWS for like local container development. So it was like, so AWS had this exact issue. They have like around like, I don't know like the actual number of employees in AWS, but like all of them had to, most of them use Mac OS, and like they have to do container development. But for them, like setting up this is difficult. Another option is like they can just, every time they can just use an EC2 VM and do that. But again, that incurs cost. So what AWS did was, there are a lot of tools that are already available in open source. They combined all of them together into a single package so that, and give it to the developers. This is also developed in open source so that others also can use it. So this is what I said, and yeah. So this Finch actually provides a single CLI to interact with the containers. So similar to how you have Docker in Linux, the Docker command in Linux, you can use Finch command on macOS to do, it's like almost 90% of whatever command that Docker supports, Finch currently supports. And it runs on both M series and Intel chips so that you don't have that Intel or like M1 series issues. And it can also launch both AMD 64 and ARM 64 containers and work on both at the same time. So this is like, this is like a rough architecture of how it's like running will be done, build, and also you can publish the images. Yeah. So now coming to the architecture of Finch. So Finch actually combines like multiple open source tools. It has like limactl, which I will explain, and every request or like every command that is executed from Finch goes through a limactl, and then you have a Linux virtual machine that is set up on Mac using a QEMU hypervisor. Apple virtualization is also currently supported, but it is not stable yet. And then inside that Linux virtual machine, you have all of these are like again open source tools, like you have netctl, BuildKit, which BuildKit some of you may have heard, it is actually used underneath Docker for building the images. Then you have containerd, that is used for like launching the containers, then CNI for setting up the network, and the QEMU user space simulation is actually used in case you want to run both AMD 64 and ARM 64 containers. So now we will go into the components of Finch. So the first one is like containerd. So containerd is actually for running the containers. This was like, so again Kubernetes now defaults to containerd as a container runtime, and netctl. This binary actually does all the heavy lifting of the CLI. netctl was actually developed for containerd itself. Then you have Lima. This is like actually for providing the VM on Mac. And then you have BuildKit. This is for like, this tool is used for building the OCI images. Now we will go into each component. Yeah. So containerd. Containerd is like an open source project. I'm a maintainer of this project. And so this is like an industry standard container runtime. So currently like we have like two runtimes that are like in the CNCF ecosystem. One is like containerd. That is like, I think it's used in most places, and the other one is like Cryo, that is mostly used in Red Hat and IBM. Yeah. So containerd actually manages the complete life cycle of the containers on the host machine. So it can be like from like storing the container layers, like launching the containers via runc or crun, and like also supervision of the container. So like, okay, if the container gets killed, like should it be restarted, or like should the status be reported somewhere, and like image transfer, like, so, like you pull an image from a registry and store it somewhere, containerd can handle that. And also about the storage and network attachment. So this is like, you need to do networking on your container. So for that also containerd does with help of a container networking interface. And then the low level storage. This is like you want to get your files on your local machine to be available inside a container. Containerd also handles that, mostly via like mount namespace. Yeah. So this is like an AWS user group like conference, and like all these tools actually use containerd underneath. So like if you use EKS, Fargate or Firecracker, everything uses like containerd underneath as the core technology. It's like used everywhere. So yeah. So next is like netctl. So this was actually developed initially to make containerd more famous. So in the initial days, like actually everyone was just like using Docker, and Docker itself was using containerd, but like no one was familiar about it. So everyone just install Docker and okay, it's like somehow spawning up containers. But like what actually happens underneath, like no one was not sure. And like no one was not sure like how to actually interface with the containerd directly. So this netctl command line was actually developed so that like people can directly interface with the containerd. So this is like a fully compatible Docker CLI. Like you can just replace Docker with netctl and it will work everywhere. And yeah, so containerd has like lot of experimental features that are coming in. Most of them are not available in Docker yet. So netctl actually gives you one way to experiment with all those new features. So a containerd 2.0 version is like currently it's in beta. Most probably it's going to be released in like the first by Jan or February of next year. So all the features that are available in containerd 2.0 in the beta version you can currently test using netctl. But like it will, all of them will eventually reach Docker, but it will take some time for the features to become stable. Yeah, so this is like how you pull an image. So you can see that I will just replace Docker with netctl and you will pull a Docker image. And same is like running. There is the command is like exactly 100% compatible with the Docker CLI. Now the next component is Lima. This was also developed as an initial step to get containerd working on Mac. So as you know, like to get Linux containers working on Mac or Windows, you first need a Linux VM. So Lima is actually Linux on Mac, but later it evolved to working on like FreeBSD and like Windows and Linux itself. It now works. So so Lima basically launches a Linux VM using QEMU hypervisor. So if you heard about QEMU, like that's like another open source tool that is used to launch hypervisors. And yeah, so Lima helps with the automatic file sharing, port forwarding. So the initial part I have mentioned about like setting up a container is like setting up a VM, a Linux VM will be so difficult because like you have to get the files in your host machine to a VM, and Lima actually handles all of that. So for file sharing, Lima uses something called SSHFS, that is like a file system over SSH. So every time you want to run a container or something, like Lima actually uses SSHFS to get the directory from your host mounted inside the container, inside the VM. Yeah, so like if you are used to using Windows, you may have like used Windows or have Windows, then you have known about like WSL2. So this is like again a VM that helps to run Linux VM on Windows. So Lima, you can say it's like almost similar to WSL2. Like all the features are similar to WSL2, but like but mostly like developed for Mac. Yeah. So yeah, the final one is like the build kit. So build kit is a tool that actually builds the images. So like whenever you do a Docker build command on your machine, what it actually does is the Docker CLI will contact the Docker daemon, which will in turn call the build kit daemon that is running on your machine. So the build kit actually takes care of converting your Docker file into like, it supports like multiple output formats, like you can create an image or a Docker tarball or like an OCI tarball, that is like a tar file which is like basically compatible with the Open Container Initiative spec, or like you can directly store into the containerd image store. Yeah, so the installation of like Finch, this is like mostly available as a single package. You can just do a brew install Finch and like it will work like out of the box, that's it. Or like it's also available as a package and you can install on Mac. And running also, like first you have to, whenever you install Finch, the first step will be like you have to initialize the Finch VM. So when you do a Finch VM init, it will start the Finch virtual machine. So Finch VM init, what it actually does is the Finch CLI will contact the Lima CTL, that is like the CLI for the Lima VM to start the VM. And from then on, the Linux virtual machine is created inside the Mac Mac OS, and then like all the networking and all the other stuff is like created. So like if you run this is just like if you run like Docker Hello World, this is similar to that. Like there is a Finch Hello World, and this will like pull all the images and like start the container. Yeah, that's it. Like if anyone of your questions. Anywhere you can. This is like completely pluggable. Just like how you use Docker, you can use it. Like exactly on Mac. Mac it's like available GA, but like on Linux and like Windows, we are still developing it. Most probably like by next March or April it should be available. Yeah. Yes, anywhere. It's just like you are using Docker, but like if you're using Docker, like most of the time like you have to Docker desktop or like you are on Linux, right? This is like similarly you can 100% you can have the same experience in a Mac. That's what Finch does. Yeah. Excuse me. Currently, the generally available version is specific to Mac. The other one is still in development. So it will be. That's what I said. It will be like available by like March, April. By that time frame, it should be available. But on Mac, it's like currently GA. Yeah. Any more questions? You can use it. So there is like a CLI that's like Finch Compose. If you use it, it will work. So actually, the CLI that I mentioned, netctl, right? Netctl is like 100% compatible with Docker. So netctl Compose is there. So when you call Finch Compose, it actually internally translates it to netctl Compose, and it will work. Yeah. More. Yeah. So that's about me. Like I'm available on this one. Like Akhil is my ID on like GitHub, Twitter or like Slack. If you want to contact me on anything related to open source or like contributing, you can contact me. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Akhil. Thank you for a wonderful session. Let me invite Neha to hand over the token of gratitude to Akhil.
Thank you.
Can we have a big round of applause for Akhil?